The summer parade was the biggest event of the year in the city. Thousands of people lined the main street, holding flags and cheering. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Street vendors sold ice cream and cold drinks. Two families who had been waiting for hours in the hot sun. Officer Sarah Martinez stood at her assigned position near the royal viewing platform. She wore the crisp blue uniform of the Royal Guard, with polished silver buttons and a ceremonial sword at her side. At 28 years old, she had served in the Royal Guard for 6 years and had never missed a parade duty. Sarah took her job seriously. The royal family would arrive soon, and her responsibility was to keep the crowd safe and organized. She watched carefully as people pressed closer to the barrier ropes, eager to get the best view possible. "Stay behind the yellow line, please." Sarah called out to a group of teenagers who were pushing forward. They smiled and stepped back politely. The crowd was in a good mood. Everyone seemed excited about seeing the king and queen. Street musicians played cheerful songs while families shared picnic lunches on blankets spread on the sidewalk. Near Sarah's position stood a woman who immediately caught her attention. The woman was about 40 years old, with expensive jewelry, and a designer dress that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. She carried a large purse with a famous brand name and wore sunglasses that looked like they belonged in a fashion magazine. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood was her name, though Sarah didn't know this yet. Mrs. Blackwood owned 3 houses, 2 luxury cars, and had never worked a day in her life. Her husband was a wealthy businessman who gave her everything she wanted, and she had grown used to getting her way in every situation. "Excuse me, officer," Mrs. Blackwood called out in a sharp voice. "I need to move closer to the front." Sarah looked over politely. "Sorry, ma'am, but everyone needs to stay behind the barrier for safety reasons. The royal procession will pass right by here, so you'll have a perfect view from where you are." Mrs. Blackwood's face showed annoyance. "Do you know who I am? My husband donated $50,000 to the police charity last year. I think I deserve better treatment than this." "I appreciate your husband's generosity, ma'am, but the safety rules apply to everyone equally. The barriers are in place to protect both the crowd and the royal family." Other people in the crowd began to notice the conversation. Some parents shushed their children so they could listen. Mrs. Blackwood's voice was getting louder and more demanding. "Ow! This is ridiculous," Mrs. Blackwood snapped. "I didn't drive an hour through traffic to stand behind a bunch of common people. Move me to the front section immediately." Sarah remained calm and professional. "Ma'am, I understand you want a good view, but I can't make exceptions to the safety protocols. Everyone here has been waiting patiently, and many of them arrived much earlier than you did." "Earlier than me?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose even higher. "These people probably don't even pay taxes, contribute more to this city in 1 year than most of them make in their entire lives." The crowd around them fell silent. Parents covered their children's ears. An elderly man shook his head in disapproval. Sarah felt embarrassed for the woman, but she maintained her professional composure. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing the other families who are here to enjoy the parade." Mrs. Blackwood removed her expensive sunglasses and glared at Sarah. "Don't you dare tell me what to do, you little government employee. I pay your salary through my taxes. You work for me." Sarah had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Mrs. Blackwood's attitude was particularly unpleasant. Still, she kept her voice steady and respectful. "Ma'am, I work for the city and the safety of all citizens. I'm going to ask you one more time to please follow the barrier rules and keep your voice down, or what?" Mrs. Blackwood challenged. "What are you going to do about it?" In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of approaching drums and trumpets. The royal procession was getting closer. She needed to focus on her duties, not argue with one demanding woman. "Ma'am, the parade is about to begin. Please enjoy the ceremony from your current position." Sarah turned away to check on other sections of the crowd. That was when Mrs. Blackwood made the decision that would change everything. She was not used to being ignored. She was not used to being told what to do. She was definitely not used to being dismissed by someone she considered. Beneath her social status, Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, raised her hand, and did something that shocked everyone watching. Mrs. Blackwood slapped Officer Sarah Martinez across the face with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent crowd. The sound was so unexpected that even the street musicians stopped playing. Sarah's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Her cheek turned red immediately, and she felt a burning sensation spread across her face. For a moment, she was too shocked to react. In 6 years of service, nothing like this had ever happened to her. The crowd gasped in unison. A mother quickly covered her young daughter's eyes. An elderly gentleman dropped his small flag in surprise. Everyone stared in complete disbelief at what they had just witnessed. "How dare you turn your back on me?" Mrs. Blackwood shouted, her face twisted with anger. "I was speaking to you." Sarah slowly turned back to face the woman who had just assaulted her. Her training kicked in, and she forced herself to remain calm despite the shock and pain. She touched her cheek briefly, then lowered her hand and looked directly at Mrs. Blackwood. "Ma'am, you just committed assault on a police officer," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "I need you to step back and calm down immediately." But Mrs. Blackwood was beyond reasoning. The attention from the crowd seemed to make her even more aggressive instead of embarrassing her. "Assault?" She laughed harshly. "That was barely a tap. You people are so dramatic. In my social circle, we call that getting someone's attention." A teenage boy in the crowd pulled out his phone and started recording. Other people began doing the same. Mrs. Blackwood was too focused on Sarah to notice the cameras pointing at her. "Ma'am," Sarah continued, "I'm going to ask you one final time to step back behind the barrier. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." "Arrest me?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice became shrill with indignation. "Do you have any idea what kind of lawyers my husband employs? I'll have your badge by the end of the week. You'll be lucky if you can get a job as a mall security guard when I'm done with you." The crowd was becoming restless. Some people started booing Mrs. Blackwood's behavior. Others called out words of support for Officer Martinez. The situation was escalating quickly. "Lady, you need to apologize right now," called out a construction worker who was holding his young son. "Mind your own business," Mrs. Blackwood snapped back at him. "This doesn't concern you people." "It concerns all of us when someone attacks a police officer," replied an elderly woman with a cane. Mrs. Blackwood whirled around to face the crowd. "All of you shut up. I have every right to demand proper service from public employees. I contribute more to this community than any of you." The booing got louder. Someone shouted, "Money doesn't give you the right to hit people." Another voice called out, "Apologize to the officer." Sarah could see that the situation was getting out of control. The royal procession was still approaching, and she needed to maintain order. But she also couldn't let the assault go unpunished. "Ma'am, please place your hands behind your back," Sarah said, reaching for her handcuffs. "Don't you touch me," Mrs. Blackwood screamed, backing away. "I'm not going anywhere with you." That's when she made her second terrible mistake of the day. Mrs. Blackwood swung her large designer purse at Sarah's head, trying to knock her away. The purse was heavy with keys, makeup, and other items. It struck Sarah on the shoulder. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Hundreds of voices rose in anger and shock. People started pressing forward, shouting at Mrs. Blackwood. The peaceful parade atmosphere had turned into something much more serious. "That's enough," Sarah called out firmly, her professional training taking complete control. She moved quickly to restrain Mrs. Blackwood before the situation could get any worse. But just as Sarah reached for the woman's wrist, something unexpected happened that would change everything. The sound of approaching horses' hooves grew louder. The royal procession was arriving at exactly the worst possible moment. And unknown to everyone in the crowd, someone very important had witnessed the entire incident from a position where they could see everything clearly. The crowd suddenly fell silent again.
Ow.
But this time, it wasn't because of Mrs. Blackwood's outrageous behavior. This time they were silent because they realized that the royal family had arrived just in time to see a citizen assault a police officer. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. King Edward arrived in a beautiful black carriage pulled by 4 white horses. Queen Margaret sat beside him, wearing an elegant blue dress and a small silver crown. They had been looking forward to greeting their people on this beautiful summer day, but as their carriage approached the viewing area, Both the king and queen immediately noticed that something was wrong. Instead of happy cheering faces, they saw a crowd focused on some kind of disturbance near the barrier. "Driver, stop here, please," King Edward called to the coachman. "Something appears to be happening." The royal carriage came to a halt about 30 feet from where Officer Martinez was attempting to arrest Mrs. Blackwood. The crowd noticed the carriage had stopped and began to quiet down, but they kept their eyes on the drama unfolding in front of them. King Edward had excellent eyesight and could see the entire situation clearly. He watched as a well-dressed woman continued to resist arrest while shouting at the police officer. He could see the red mark on the officer's face and observed the professional way she was handling an obviously difficult situation. "Margaret, do you see what's happening over there?" the king asked his wife quietly. Queen Margaret adjusted her glasses and looked carefully. "It appears that woman is attacking the police officer, Edward. How terrible." Mrs. Blackwood was so focused on her argument with Officer Martinez that she hadn't noticed the royal carriage had stopped nearby. She continued to pull away from Sarah's attempts to handcuff her. "Get your hands off me!" Mrs. Blackwood screamed. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. I want your badge number. My husband will hear about this." Sarah remained calm and professional despite being assaulted twice. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault on a police officer and disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent." "I will not remain silent," Mrs. Blackwood shouted back. "Do you know who I am?"
Do you have any idea how much money my
family has?" That's when King Edward made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own security team. "Driver," the king said, "take us closer. I want to hear this conversation." The royal coachman looked uncertain. "Perhaps. We should continue with the parade route. The security team would prefer closer. Please," King Edward repeated firmly. The carriage moved forward until it was only about 10 feet from the incident. Now the king and queen could hear every word clearly. More importantly, some people in the crowd began to notice that the royal carriage had moved closer. Instead of continuing past, Mrs. Blackwood was still shouting at Officer Martinez. "My husband donated to the police charity. I have connections at City Hall. You can't treat me like some common criminal." "Ma'am, everyone is equal under the law," Sarah replied calmly while finally managing to get one handcuff on Mrs. Blackwood's wrist. "Your donations don't give you the right to assault police officers." King Edward leaned forward in his seat. He had heard enough to understand the situation completely. Queen Margaret looked at her husband with curiosity, recognizing the expression on his face that meant he was about to do something unexpected. "Edward," Queen Margaret whispered, "what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that young officer is handling herself remarkably well under very difficult circumstances." The king replied quietly, "I'm thinking that woman needs to learn an important lesson about how we treat people in our kingdom." Just then, a small child in the crowd pointed at the royal carriage and called out loudly, "Mama, look, it's the king and queen." The crowd began to turn their attention to the carriage. People started bowing and curtsying. The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Blackwood heard the commotion and finally looked around. Saw the royal carriage so close to her, her face went completely pale. For the first time since the incident began, she seemed to realize that her behavior had been witnessed by people far more important than she had imagined. "Oh no," she whispered, suddenly understanding the situation she had created. Officer Martinez also noticed the royal presence but continued to do her job professionally. She had successfully handcuffed Mrs. Blackwood and was preparing to escort her away from the crowd. King Edward stood up in his carriage so that everyone could see him clearly. The entire crowd fell completely silent, waiting to see what their monarch would do. Officer King Edward called out in a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire area, "Might I have a word with you?" Sarah looked up at the king with surprise. "Of course, Your Majesty." Mrs. Blackwood's legs felt weak. She realized that the King of England just witnessed her assaulting a police officer and making a public spectacle of herself. This was far worse than anything she could have imagined when she woke up that morning. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Martinez walked toward the royal carriage, keeping one hand on Mrs. Blackwood's arm to ensure she didn't try to escape. Thousands of eyes watched every step. The silence was so complete that people could hear the clip-clop of horses, hooves from the rest of the parade still approaching from several blocks away. "Your Majesty," Sarah said, bowing respectfully when she reached the carriage. King Edward smiled warmly at her. "Officer, I couldn't help but notice what just transpired here. Are you injured?" Sarah touched her still red cheek briefly. "Fine. Your Majesty, just doing my job. Doing it remarkably well, I must say." The king's voice was loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "I witnessed this entire incident from the beginning, and I was impressed by your professionalism and restraint." Mrs. Blackwood stood frozen beside Sarah, her face growing paler by the second. She wanted to disappear into the ground, but had no choice but to stand there while the king spoke. "Your Majesty," Sarah replied, "I was simply following proper procedures. For crowd control and dealing with a disruptive individual." King Edward nodded approvingly. "Officer, in my 40 years of public service, I have rarely seen such grace under pressure. You were assaulted twice, yet you maintained your composure and treated this woman with dignity even while arresting her." The crowd began to murmur with approval. Several people started clapping softly. Queen Margaret stood up beside her husband. "Officer, what is your name?" "Officer Sarah Martinez, Your Majesty." "Officer Martinez," the Queen said with a gentle smile, "you represent the very best of our police force. Your parents should be very proud of you." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but maintained her professional composure. "Thank you, Your Majesty. That means everything to me." King Edward then turned his attention to Mrs. Blackwood, who was trembling slightly and staring at the ground. "And you, madam?" the king said, his tone becoming more serious. "What is your name?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Victoria Blackwood, Your Majesty." "Mrs. Blackwood, I heard you mention several times during this incident that you believe your wealth and social status entitle you to special treatment. Is that correct?" Mrs. Blackwood's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "Your Majesty, I was upset about the view, and Mrs. Blackwood," the king interrupted gently but firmly, "I asked you a simple question. Do you believe that having money makes you more important than other citizens?" The crowd leaned forward, eager to hear her response. Mrs. Blackwood looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue her from this nightmare. I suppose I got carried away, Your Majesty." King Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want to tell you something that I hope you will remember for the rest of your life." The entire crowd held its breath. "I am the king of this realm. I was born into wealth and privilege that you could never imagine. I live in palaces, I wear crowns, and people bow when they see me." The king paused to let his words sink in. "But I would never ever raise my hand against a police officer or any other person serving our community." Mrs. Blackwood began to cry silently, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done. "Do you know why, Mrs. Blackwood?" "No, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Because true nobility has nothing to do with money or titles. True nobility comes from how we treat other people, especially those who are serving us and protecting us." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. "Officer Martinez showed true nobility today. She was patient with you, she remained professional when you became abusive, and she continued to treat you with respect even after you assaulted her." The king looked directly at Mrs. Blackwood. "You, on the other hand, showed us what happens when someone mistakes privilege for permission to treat others badly." Mrs. Blackwood was now crying openly, overwhelmed by shame and the realization of what she had done in front of thousands of people in the royal family. "Queen Margaret spoke up. Mrs. Blackwood, do you have anything you would like to say to Officer Martinez?" Mrs. Blackwood looked up at Sarah with tears streaming down her face. For the first time all day, her voice was soft and genuine. "Officer Martinez, I am deeply, deeply sorry. I was wrong to hit you. I was wrong to yell at you. You were just doing your job and you didn't deserve any of what I did to you." Sarah nodded graciously. "I accept your apology, ma'am." But King Edward wasn't finished yet. What he said next would shock everyone present and create a story that would be told for generations. King Edward looked thoughtfully at both women for a long moment. The crowd waited in absolute silence, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Officer Martinez," the king said. "I would like to make you an offer." Sarah looked surprised. "Your Majesty? I am creating a new position in the Royal Guard, a special liaison officer who will work directly with the palace to improve community relations and train other officers in proper conduct. The position comes with a significant promotion and salary increase. Would you be interested?" The crowd gasped. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say. That's an incredible honor. You've earned it through your actions today. Someone who can remain so professional under such difficult circumstances is exactly what we need in a leadership role." Sarah felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "I would be honored to accept, Your Majesty." The crowd burst into spontaneous applause and cheering. People whistled and called out words of congratulations. Sarah had gone from being assaulted at her job to being personally promoted by the king in the span of 30 minutes. King Edward then turned back to Mrs. Blackwood, whose face showed a mixture of shame and fear about what her punishment might be. "Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned that your husband is generous with charitable donations." "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied nervously. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can face the full legal consequences of assaulting a police officer, which could include jail time and a permanent criminal record." Mrs. Blackwood's face went white with terror. "Or," the king continued, "you can accept an alternative sentence. That, I believe, will be more educational for you." "What kind of alternative, Your Majesty?" "You will spend 100 hours volunteering with the police department, doing community service work. You will help at food banks, clean up parks, and assist with programs that help people who are less fortunate than you." Mrs. Blackwood looked confused. "I don't understand, Your Majesty. Why would you offer me that option?" Queen Margaret spoke. Because, Mrs. Blackwood, we believe that people can change. Your behavior today was terrible, but it came from ignorance, not evil. Working alongside the people you insulted today might teach you something valuable about the worth of every human being." King Edward nodded. "How are their conditions?" "First, you must publicly apologize, not just to Officer Martinez, but to this entire crowd for disrupting their family day." Mrs. Blackwood nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Second, your community service must be completed within 6 months. And Officer Martinez will receive regular reports on your progress and attitude." Sarah looked surprised to be included in the arrangement, but she nodded her acceptance. "And third," the king continued, "if you fail to complete the service with a good attitude, or if you ever again treat a public servant with such disrespect, you will face the full legal consequences with no further mercy from the court." "I understand, Your Majesty." "I accept those terms gratefully." King Edward gestured for Mrs. Blackwood to address the crowd. She turned to face the thousands of people who had witnessed her behavior. "Everyone," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I owe all of you an apology. You came here with your families to enjoy a beautiful day and see the royal parade. Instead, I ruined your experience with my selfish and cruel behavior." The crowd listened silently, their anger beginning to fade as they heard genuine remorse in her voice. "You're always wrong to think that having money made me better than anyone else. I was wrong to insult you and call you names. And I was especially wrong to attack Officer Martinez, who was just trying to keep all of us safe." She turned back to Sarah. "Officer Martinez, I hope that someday you might be able to forgive me completely. I promise that I will spend the next 6 months trying to become the kind of person who deserves that forgiveness." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think the king and queen have given you a wonderful opportunity to grow as a person. I hope you'll take full advantage of it." King Edward smiled at both women. "Excellent. Officer Martinez, someone from the palace will contact you tomorrow about your new position, Mrs. Blackwood. You will report to the police station on Monday morning to begin your community service." The king then stood up in his carriage and addressed the entire crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you witnessed something that happens far too rarely in our world. You saw someone take responsibility for their mistakes and commit to doing better. You also saw an example of the kind of character and professionalism we should all strive for in our daily lives." The crowd cheered enthusiastically. "But most importantly," the king concluded, "you saw that every person, regardless of their wealth or position, is accountable for how they treat others. That is the foundation of a just and decent society. As the royal carriage prepared to continue with the parade, nobody could have predicted the lasting impact this incident would have on all of their lives. 6 months later, Officer Sarah Martinez walked through the same street where the parade incident had occurred. But now she wore a different uniform, the gold and navy blue of the Royal Guard's Community Relations Division. Her new rank insignia showed her promotion to lieutenant. The position King Edward had offered her had transformed not just her career, but her entire life. She now traveled throughout the kingdom, training police officers in community engagement and conflict resolution. She had spoken at universities, written training manuals, become a role model for young people considering careers in law enforcement. As she walked past the spot where she had been slapped 6 months earlier, Sarah smiled at the memory. What? It seemed like the worst moment of her career had. It's actually become the best thing that ever happened to her. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, Lieutenant Martinez. I wanted to let you know that I finished my community service today. Thank you for your patience and guidance over these past months. I hope you can join my family for dinner next week. To celebrate, Victoria. Sarah smiled as she read the message. Mrs. Blackwood's transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. The community service had started roughly. Victoria had arrived at the food bank on her first day wearing designer clothes and looking miserable. She had complained about the smell, the work, and the people she was serving. But gradually, something began to change. Working alongside police officers, firefighters, and social workers, Victoria started to understand the challenges facing her community. She met homeless veterans, struggling single mothers, and elderly people living on tiny pensions. For the first time in her privileged life, she saw poverty and hardship up close. The turning point had come during her 3rd week of service. Victoria was helping serve meals at a homeless shelter when she recognized one of the men in line. Her husband's former business partner who had lost everything in a bad investment. The man was embarrassed to see her, but Victoria surprised everyone, including herself, by treating him with kindness and respect. That night, Victoria had called Sarah in tears. I never understood, she had sobbed into the phone. I thought poor people were poor because they were lazy or stupid. But these are good people who just had bad luck or made mistakes. They could be me. They could be anyone. From that day forward, Victoria approached her community service with genuine enthusiasm. She learned the names of the people she served. She'd listened to their stories. She began to understand that dignity and worth had nothing to do with bank account balances. Now, as Sarah read Victoria's text message, she felt proud of how far the woman had come. The final report from the community service supervisor had described Victoria as transformed, dedicated, and genuinely caring. Sarah's phone rang. It was King Edward himself. Lieutenant Martinez, I hope you're well. Very well, Your Majesty. Thank you for calling. I wanted to let you know that Mrs. Blackwood has requested to continue her volunteer work even though her sentence is complete. She's asked to establish a charitable foundation to help with community programs. Sarah wasn't surprised. Victoria had mentioned wanting to do more during their recent conversations. That's wonderful news, Your Majesty. Indeed. But I'm calling for another reason as well. The Queen and I would like to invite you to a special ceremony next week. What kind of ceremony, Your Majesty? We're creating a new annual award called the Community Guardian Award. It will be given to police officers who demonstrate exceptional character while serving the public. You will be the first recipient. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Your Majesty, I'm overwhelmed. Thank you, Lieutenant Martinez. That day at the parade, you showed thousands of people what true strength looks like. Not the kind of strength that comes from power or wealth, but the kind that comes from character and integrity. After the call ended, Sarah sat on a park bench and reflected on how much her life had changed. The incident that could have been just another unpleasant day at work had become a story that inspired people throughout the kingdom. Schools now taught lessons about the parade incident, emphasizing themes of respect, responsibility, and redemption. The video recordings taken by crowd members had been viewed millions of times online, but not as entertainment, as education. Children wrote essays about Officer Martinez's patience and professionalism. Adults discussed how King Adua had balanced justice with mercy in dealing with Mrs. Blackwood. Social workers used Victoria's transformation as an example of how people could change when given the right opportunities. The story had even inspired. Legislative changes, laws, required community service options for certain non-violent crimes, giving offenders chances to learn empathy and make amends rather than simply serving jail time. A week later, at the award ceremony, Sarah stood before another crowd, this time in the palace courtyard. But instead of anger and chaos, the atmosphere was filled with celebration and hope. King Edward placed the Community Guardian Medal around her neck, while Queen Margaret and hundreds of guests applauded. In the front row sat Victoria Blackwood, with her husband and children, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Edward announced, "Lieutenant Martinez reminds us that true heroism isn't about fighting villains or performing dramatic rescues. Sometimes it's about maintaining your dignity and principles when someone treats you badly. Sometimes it's about showing mercy to those who don't deserve it. And sometimes it's about believing that people can change for the better." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah realized that the most important lesson from that parade day wasn't about dealing with difficult people or following proper procedures. It was about the power of giving people second chances and the amazing transformations that could happen when justice was combined with compassion. The woman who had slapped her 6 months ago was now one of her closest friends and most dedicated. Community volunteers. The incident that had started with hatred and privilege had ended with friendship and service to others. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundation for the best chapters that follow. And sometimes a single act of grace can change not just individual hearts, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to treat each other with dignity and respect. The parade that day had celebrated the royal family, and it had taught everyone presents a much more important lesson about the royalty that exists within every person who chooses to act with character, compassion, and courage.